We are back at the 4 o'clock hour, the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center here on Business Monday. I'm Josh Fenton. He is cha-ching, Gary Sasse, the money man, knower of everything fiscal in Rhode Island and in the United States. We've not tested his global knowledge recently, but let's go to Detroit. I think the big three automakers are still in Detroit. Numbers coming out of Detroit say that GM's going to lay off 15% of its salaried workers in the United States and in Canada. It sticks out to me, not that big layoffs at major corporations are shocking anymore, but it does seem a little unusual in a period of time with low unemployment when auto consumption is usually at its height. Is this cleaning up dead wood, or is this an indication? I asked Megan Decker, she did not agree, but I inferred that this is a number that may be shifting transportation tastes to Ubers, Lyfts, bird scooters, and all the rest might have a little implication on the demand for U.S. autos.
Well, I think it's the kind of cars that are being produced. Some of the plants, they're closing 5 plants, so that's how they're laying off 15,000 people.
Yeah.
One of the plants they closed will produce a Chevy Cruze, which is not a very popular car. So I would start by asking the question is what part of the layoffs resulting from poor engineering, poor design, poor planning, poor marketing, and I think that's a big part of it. I think the second, which we've known for a long time, when you talk about the auto industry, whether you're a German company or a Japanese company, you're building your cars in America.
Yeah.
So BMW is building cars in America, Mercedes is building cars in Alabama. The Japanese manufacturers have been building cars in Tennessee and Kentucky.
Ohio,
for a long time.
yeah.
When I lived in Tennessee, we lived right next to something that was called the Smyrna Air Base, a big Air Force base. The government gave it over to the state as surplus property, and 2 months later it was sold to, at that time it was called Datsun, but it was sold to Nissan.
Right.
And now I don't know how many jobs they have out there, but it's a major manufacturing facility. So if you can't compete with the right designs, if your cars are not popular, internationally you're going to have your lunch eaten, but internationally it doesn't mean that the cars are just produced in Germany or in Sweden or in Japan. Those cars are produced here. And so General Motors, being part of that global economy, has to look strategically where they locate their plants.
So you're voting no on an indication of overall demand for autos, or are we hitting a different behavioral?
I don't know. I think people are driving cars longer.
Yeah.
I don't have any data to back that up.
No, that is true. Absolutely. They're better built.
They're better built. So that impacts on it. And so there are a lot of behavioral changes. I think the demand for cars in the urban areas is less. It's less with the new generation of kids that want to be hip and live in the middle of cities. They have less need, for a car. They could do the Uber or Lyft or Hertz or whatever
right.
Over the weekends. So there are behavioral shifts, but I think the fundamental demand for family cars, the fundamental fact that we are largely a suburban country, is going to have a demand for automobiles, but the demand is going to be dampened by the factors that I just mentioned.
Let's shift to Rhode Island and the issue of gambling as a revenue stream. When you were director of administration at a revenue, it was the golden goose. It was growing.
Well, my experience wasn't so golden because one of the first things Governor Carcieri had me do was to work with the original owners of Twin River, and go through I managed a very difficult bankruptcy process.
Right.
So it was laying some eggs for the state, but it wasn't laying a lot of eggs for the investors. And because of the bankruptcy, the balance sheet got cleaned up. The new people came in who've been good operators.
Yeah.
And it's been laying some golden eggs. But there's another example where it's not so golden. The receipts from traditional lottery games.
All down. Almost all down.
All down.
And even the new games aren't hitting the numbers that I think they anticipated. They're flat, marginally up. They've had obviously a lot of problems getting the sports betting up. Missed, according to experts in Las Vegas, they missed 75% of the revenue opportunity because they missed almost all of college football, beginning of basketball, World Series, beginning of hockey, most of the NFL season, most of the early betting on college basketball. So Las Vegas, a professor out there at University of Las Vegas, Nevada says it's probably 75%, that 2 month, approximately 2 month delay. Do we really need to think about our dependency on that revenue stream? Because there's not a lot of new games to be had other than rollerball, I guess.
No, the market, there was a time there where everyone thought they would just open up a casino and it would, like you say, produce the golden goose. There are more facilities now, more venues
right.
For gambling. But I think if you look at the state budget and say we're generating roughly $300 million from gambling, it won't grow as quickly as it's been growing. It may decline slightly, but it's not going to necessarily fall off the cliff. So it's there. It'll produce about 10-11% of revenue, but it's not going to be 15 or 20%.
Because of that, Massachusetts opened their first 2 marijuana retail operations last week. I think it was Monday or Tuesday. They did at 2 very rural locations. They did $400,000 in sales, $78,000 in tax revenue from those 2 stores alone in one day. Now, obviously, it was first day, but the reports off of Saturday after the holiday was equally significant. They're going to open a ton more of retail locations, I'm sure. Whether legal or not, some of them are Rhode Islanders. They sell to out-of-staters. Is that the next place that lawmakers will be forced to look at for new revenue opportunities, both based on public demand? A majority of Rhode Islanders would like to see legalization, coupled with the thirst for a new revenue structure.
Oh, the pressure will be on because the state's budget is still not in great shape. There's still deficits. Yes, I think there will be some pressure to do it. I think the governor's taken the right wait and see attitude. I think when you talk about revenue and budgets reflect values, there is a debate on both sides. Whether selling recreational marijuana is a necessity or whether it's being driven by just the sake for more money to support more spending. Because every time we increase the revenue to support more spending, the spending outgrows the revenues. It outpaces the revenues. Our problem is that not that we haven't done well with revenue. It's that we haven't done well controlling spending. So don't look at it as a cure-all. Look at it as a one-time fix. And then what are the trade-offs for this one-time fix? Is it the practical reality that Rhode Island isn't going to go to Massachusetts and buy pot, and so they'll stay here and pay taxes, or are there other costs associated with it, or are there values that we have as a state that suggest that it may not be good to be a state that legalizes recreational sale of marijuana?
If you play out the math a little bit and expand what the potential marketplace is, it could be a revenue source in the Commonwealth of $1 million a day in new tax revenue. Now, if you extrapolate that to Rhode Island and say, okay, it's going to be a sixth of it, we're talking about $50 million in new tax revenue or upwards.
Well, put that in perspective. Let's say we're talking about $20 million in new tax revenue. I just pulled this number out of the air. I have no idea what the estimates are. Our general revenue is about $3.9 billion. So at that point, it's a half of 1%. And if that number's right, even if it was 1%, even if we generated 30 or 35 million or 40 million, I don't look askew at $40 million, but it's 1% of budget.
Yeah.
And so what are the costs involved for generating additional 1%? And what's going to be the elasticity of that 1%? Because we'll spend it 4 or 5 times before we're finished with it.
So you're a nay on the legalization of marijuana.
Well, not for fiscal reasons. If you ask me, something that I understand about fiscal policy, I'm kind of agnostic on it right now, but personally, I have values that suggest that legalizing marijuana or legalizing any substance and having more widespread use of a substance that are habit forming is not a good idea. It's just I don't believe, I think it's a healthy environment. I believe something that is not backed by science at all. It's just a belief that it's an introductory, stimulus to other kinds of drug use. I'm concerned that marijuana could find its way into chocolate chip cookies that kids buy at the 7-Eleven.
Happens all the time.
And so because of those reasons, I think you have to say, okay, there are economic benefits. I don't think anybody would argue. We might argue on the degree of that economic benefit, but there are also social costs, and there are also costs about value and what your sense of community is. And when I look at all those issues and not look at it fiscally, it's just from a government finance perspective, I have prejudices, I have biases. And my bias is against illegal, not illegal anymore, but making substances more available.
Rhode Island's budget is, despite low unemployment and a fairly decent economy, we're looking at deficits in this fiscal year and in next fiscal year. They're not off the charts. They're not 10% of budget. We've talked about this a number of times. It is a nuisance. It is an aggravation. It doesn't allow for a lot of creativity and new programming if you're constantly, as you know, sending down to the departments and saying, give me all the departments, please get us a 10% cut to each of your budgets type of thing. Is there any chance of ever breaking the cycle of deficit structure issues related to?
All states have deficit structures, unless you have an
Do they have it every single year, whether it's good times or bad?
Very few budgets are going to come in at zero. So in good times, you may have a amount of surplus. In bad times.
So shouldn't we be on the surplus side?
Well, the problem we have is our mix, and the biggest.
And also with a 4-year, one of the arguments for having 4-year terms for governor was that it would allow governors to plan out and be better fiscal managers because they didn't have to be so responsive to.
We didn't go to 4-year terms of the legislature. So enough said about that. I think the problem with the deficit this year, we have a deficit. We continue to have a deficit. Is to ask, the first question is why, and we know the deficit is being caused by overspending. Where? Well, because of the amount we spend on Medicaid, on social services, the dependence of the population on those kinds of services, that's running good money away. And so the biggest problem of the deficits is you keep on funding what you're doing because that's their entitlements, you're committed to do it, and you never have enough money to make investments at scale. We make investments, but not always at scale. And so the issue of the deficit, when you look long term about what this state's going to look like and what we need to be investing in, is the opportunity cost. Instead of putting more money into the University of Rhode Island, instead of putting more money into certain educational programs, whether it's bilingual or building a real career tech school, no one or doing what the governor says she's doing with computers in every school, but we'll have to go to every school to find them. You're not doing what you know you need to do to make the investments to make this place more productive, and the reason you're not doing it is you're always dilling around with this deficit, caused by overspending on programs where you have very little control, where you certainly don't have the policy incentives to make changes and manage those programs more effectively.
Will we just kick the can again this year?
I don't, unless there's a second coming. I imagine that's possible. Yeah.
Is it frustrating? Listen, nobody wants a deficit. Nobody wants a deficit in good times. Nobody wants a deficit when you functionally have full employment. Does it worry you? Should it worry the governor? Should it worry lawmakers that when the next recession comes and some revenues begin to dip, that it's going to cause some real pain and suffering, do some key programs.
Big time. There's the old fable that smart squirrel put away the nuts during summer, and the dumb squirrel just ate all the nuts, and he froze his ass off in the winter. Well, we've had some good times, and we've invested a hell of a lot of money in real estate and certain economic development. And the question is, have we done anything to change Rhode Island as being a first in, last out state? And when I look at the projections that are made by the state, made for the state by IHS Markit as part of the Revenue Estimating Conference, they project that over the next 5-year period, or the period of 2018 through 2023, Rhode Island will be 43rd in employment growth, 46th in personal income growth. We know that if you held the labor force steady, just theoretically held the labor force steady, our unemployment rate wouldn't be 3.8 or 3.9%, it would be 6.1%. And so while we have invested a lot, and while we've done some good things to make the state more competitive, particularly in the area of business taxes, we still have not done things at scale to be game changers, to not become the first in and the first out state. So when you put hundreds of millions of dollars and emphasize real estate as opposed to education, or as opposed to other kinds of structural reforms, you have the high, you feel good. Construction guys are working. Construction is not up that much, but it's up some. And you see the 1 or 2 cranes in the sky building apartments no one could afford to live in, or hotels. We're not sure what the occupancy rates are going to be. But as soon as that stops and the recession happens, you don't maximize the gains you could have made in changing the structure. And there are a couple of really basic economic lessons, and this you have to give credit to some economists at Harvard who did not original thinking. When you look at what states need to do and how they need to compete, you find out that the states compete to provide the most productive environment. And what that means is an environment where business can make the most productive use of its people, of its capital, of the state's natural resources.
Right.
And so if you become more productive, you're more competitive. That's the basic definition. Innovation drives competitiveness. Now, we know what you have to do to become more competitive, and we do some of it, but not enough of it. You have to get rid of a lot of regulations and permitting. You've got to do things that necessarily drive up the cost of doing business in the state. You need to invest like hell in research institutions and public and higher education, both public and private. You need to be relentless about school reform. We don't even have a strategy to reform our schools. You need to promote clusters.
Yeah.
And we recognize all those things. So you can go through the budget, and I can find you 50,000 here, or 100,000 there, or maybe $1 million, somewhere else to do some of those things. But that doesn't make a change. They need to be at scale. And so the question, the concern I have about how Commerce Rhode Island has made investments is we put a lot in real estate. And in about 5 years, we're going to wake up, and I'm not going to pretend to answer the question. We're going to find out, whether we over-invested in real estate to the underinvestment in things that would make us a more productive state.
Yeah.
Building another building is a good thing. Real estate is part of the equation. But the real estate per se doesn't make you more productive. And so there may be a difference between a Wexford project, or Wexford is originally envisioned, and building 5 hotels with publicly subsidized hotels. That's what they used to do in communist Russia. They would publicly subsidize their hotels over there too. So
is that a slightly damning statement on our economic
it's
development strategy?
It's a historical
reference. Yeah.
But that's the important question, because you need an agenda. The agenda, I think, others may disagree, needs to be focused on how we make the state most productive it can be, because the most competitive states are the most productive states, and we recognize that.
So let me ask a couple questions. So whether it's Governor Raimondo or her predecessor or predecessors, there have been historically so many holes, right? Old infrastructure, 50th ranked in roads and bridges, underperforming elementary and secondary schools, per dollar invested arguably amongst the worst. low ranking in many national analyses. A demand for hotels. One of the highest occupancy rates over the last few years, potential for greater growth within the tourism industry, hampered by the lack of hotels. Is it that there's so many problems that you just can't touch them all? You just can't address them all?
It's a question of choices and priorities. Now, you cannot pay attention to the problems, but I'll ask you a very simple question. If you believe, which I do and others may not, that the key to becoming a more productive state are people, are a labor force, then you invest more in schools, you invest more in higher education, you invest more in public school, performance, public school quality. You say no to some of the special interest adults who may be holding you back from doing that. You take on that fight, and you believe that that's the best investment that has the highest marginal utility of making, that investment. That doesn't say you ignore some of the other things. You can't ignore those kinds of things, but it's a question of choices and allocation. And I get concerned that when you look through the economic development plan, I could find you a program du jour, and they sound good, probably useful, most cases not at scale. And so you have to have the courage of your convictions to say the most important things we need to do are X. Now, you and I can sit here and we can disagree. You can say the most important thing is Y, and we should be using 50% of our resources for Y. I could say X, and we can have that debate, but make the decision and then move forward. I haven't seen that in our economic development program. I joke about the real estate, but I look at the Wavemaker program. That's a good program. Some of the tax incentives are helpful. Some I think are less helpful. But the jobs tax credit is worked well.
Last question for you. We see a number of potentially coolings. The stock market's been volatile. Real estate prices in Rhode Island seem to have stabilized. They've certainly slowed in their growth in many ways. In hot markets like the East Side and some others, you're seeing a flattening out. They were sort of in hypergrowth. Are we cooling as an economy, and does that necessarily mean, because we are cooling, mean that we're headed towards a recession, or is it just a cooling off period and we could hit another period of growth?
Well, I think the economy, not just our economy, but the international economy is cooling. Look at what's happening in Europe right now. There's clearly a slowdown,
if not a recession.
And so if Europe sneezes, we get a cold. So there are factors beyond our control. But the important point that you're making, and I don't know the answer to the question, if the economists that say we're a first in, last out state are right, then and the economy cools, we get hit pretty hard. And it takes us longer to get out. And my point, if you dismiss everything else I've said, is during good times, what have we done to change the belief of many economists? I'm not saying I agree with it, but many economists that we're a first in, last out state that when the economic cycle changes, and that would be the pity of the whole thing is that we've invested hundreds of millions of dollars. We've improved infrastructure. We've improved our tax competitiveness. But at the end of the day, we don't have any more control over our destiny than before this started. And that's how this administration is going to be judged 4 or 5 years from now.
Gary Sasse, the money man. I know it's been a difficult few days after a very emotionally charged rivalry football game down
after the first half, when you know what's happening.
Florida State. It was not pretty, but the season's over.
God is great.
God is great.
Well, now it's time to get ready for the revenge tour. And I think the revenge tour won't start next year, but it'll start in 2020.
Can anyone beat Alabama?
Yeah, I think somebody can beat Alabama. I think Clemson has a shot. I'm looking for really a great SEC championship game. Georgia has a good offensive line. They have
They always have great running backs, that's for sure.
They have good running backs. They got two decent quarterbacks. They got a defensive-minded coach, Kirby Smart, who came from Alabama.
Right.
So, yeah, I think that'll be a competitive game.
Thank you so much. We're going to be right back in about 30 seconds with Saul Kaplan here at the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. Mr. Innovation, Gary Sasse, the Money Man, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
We'll be right back.